Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 10 lecture. So like I said last week, we're really going to devote 2 weeks, generally speaking, to literary criticism and theory. So last week we approached what we called sort of author-based approaches. We also talked about more reader-based approaches to criticism. And, these are just tools, strategies that are often used by scholars, critics, experts, people who typically write about literature, people who typically interpret and analyze literature in much the same way that we are. So we talked a little bit about the history of literary criticism last week. If you remember, I sort of covered that briefly, and then we got into some of these major categories. So we're really thinking about criticism in 3 big sort of broad categories. We started with author-based, and we talked a little bit about, the biographical approach that is sort of a traditional way to interpret or analyze literature. But as I said, we don't necessarily use bio a whole lot, typically in this class or at this level. And then we also talked a little bit about reader response and reception theory, which really qualify more as reader-based approaches to criticism. So just really kind of centering or prioritizing the reader, whereas the biographical approach would have obviously centered or prioritized the author. So with reader response, and I got into this in a lot more detail in our discussion post because I actually kind of neglected to really mention this in last week's lecture. Reader response really gives us a lot of our vocabulary, a lot of the language that we use in modern day lit classes, and really just our overall desire to interpret and provide original interpretations of the text that we read. Like I pointed out in the Week 9 discussion, an important thing to know about the formalists, the new critics who gave us close reading, a technique that we obviously still use. But another important thing to remember about those guys is that they believe that if you employed this sort of rigorous, almost scientific study of language, these specific features of language like we were talking about weeks ago when we were talking about close reading, they thought if you did that, you would arrive at the one true interpretation of the text. A lot of them really believed that there was only one correct reading or really one correct sort of analysis of a literary text. And we largely reject that line of thinking. And again, they also said, don't think about yourself, don't think about the author, and don't think about outside contexts. And we reject those directives as well. We think all of those things are pretty important. But what the reader response critics gave us a couple of decades after the formalists is they really opened things up for individuals to be able to arrive really at a wide range of potential interpretations. And this is still largely how we think. We typically think that any individual reader who does have certain qualifications, like I was talking about in the Week 9 discussion, and we can kind of return to that or think more about that because some people have a problem with the idea of the ideal reader or this idea of an intended audience for a text. And if you're not a part of that intended audience, maybe you're not really going to get it. We might reject that line of thinking, but what the reader response critics said is, look, if you fall within the general parameters of who this person is writing for, if you are a college student, if you are a person who likes to read literature, you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a scholar, you don't necessarily have to be an academic, but you do probably need to have some kind of background, some kind of experience with reading literature. That's kind of what we mean when we say some of these qualifications that get imposed. But if you're a member of that group, of that target audience, your interpretation is valid even if it differs from mine. If we both read the same novel or the same poem, but we arrive at very different interpretations, very different sort of arguments as far as what we think the texts are doing, what we think characters or imagery might be doing in those texts. And we don't have to necessarily think that one of us is wrong while the other one is right. This is kind of the joke that people make a lot in English class. We say, it's not math. there's not just one right answer typically when you're interpreting text, because text, like we talked about a little bit last week with post-structuralism, language in particular, is kind of slippery. It can be a little unstable, and we know that language changes over time. So what a text might mean to me could be very different from what it means to you or to some other ideal reader, because we all have different life experiences, we have different sort of expectations, things that we want from a text, that's part of it, but we also have different sort of intellectual inclinations, right? We might interpret different events in different ways. The same event in two different ways, or we might see the same character, but I think one way about the character and you think a very different way. So again, this is all very normal and standard to us, but reader response critics really help to sort of normalize and standardize this way of thinking in college literature classes. The idea that, hey, you don't have to worry if your interpretation's wrong, but again, there is this baseline or this sort of threshold that we are expected to meet if we're conducting reader response type of criticism or theory. Again, we have to sort of read the text carefully and somewhat accurately. And again, there's this expectation that we have a certain level of knowledge as members of the audience, the intended audience, as members of, or examples of this ideal reader. We know certain things. We've read novels before. We've read poems before. And it might even help if we're familiar with this author or if we're familiar with the genre that the author is working in. Like I mentioned in the discussion board, we might be readers, but if this is a brand new genre to us with new stylistics, new sort of expectations, new conventions that we're not familiar with, we might not be the intended audience at that point. Like, the author might be signaling to people who know a lot about that genre or to people who possess a certain knowledge that maybe in some cases we don't. But then we might also think that authors are being more inclusive and including people of all stripes. So again, it's not everybody necessarily buys the idea that we have ideal readers and you kind of have to fall in that target audience. But we do like the freedom that reader response theory and criticism sort of gave us, because it sort of authorized individuals to come up with their own original interpretations. There's not one true interpretation. There can be many. But again, the way we limit the possible number of interpretations in order to avoid having an endless possible number is we do tend to use these ideas of the ideal reader and target audiences. And again, that's kind of interesting to think about in its own right, and that might lead you into a little bit more of reception theory, which isn't so much focused on the text always, like in terms of like textual elements, but more so what the text is doing in the world, how the text is received, how the text is written about, talked about, the effects it might have in the larger culture or society. That's a whole nother sort of line. That's a whole nother pursuit of scholarship that, some of us might end up being interested in. So we covered that stuff last week, and then we also talked a little bit about text-based approaches, and that's of course formalism, right? These are the critical schools that are really focused on the text itself. And again, the formalists didn't care about the author. They didn't care much about readers or how readers felt. They really wanted to approach texts in this kind of quasi-scientific way. Let's break them down into their most basic elements, which is, would of course be individual lines or sentences or words or syllables. And we've been doing some close reading. So that really is formalist or formal analysis in that traditional sense. And again, we still borrow that. We still use that, but we reject a lot of their sort of doctrinaire, sort of rigid ways of viewing literary analysis. And again, reader response kind of helped to open that up. So we mentioned formalism as a prime example of text-based criticism, and then we also mentioned structuralism and post-structuralism. We didn't spend a ton of time on those. Those are kind of tricky, but I did mention that they come from other disciplines, right? At least structuralism does. It's really more sort of a gift from the social sciences in a lot of ways, and a lot of our concepts that we still use from that school really come from anthropologists and linguists, not necessarily lit scholars, but lit scholars adopted some of those ideas about language systems and about signifiers and what they signify, because that stuff matters in literature, right? I mean, it matters in any type of text, but you can conduct that kind of analysis, that kind of structural analysis, really at any point in a literature class. That's always fair game. Not everybody wants to, but it's certainly available to you if you're interested in sort of systems of meaning and how language systems create meaning. But also, if you're a little bit more inclined towards being maybe a contrarian, or you like to question authority, or you like to maybe subvert standards or conventions, you might like the post-structuralists, because their whole thing, when they accepted a lot of the ideas from the structuralists, but they were just saying, hey, the language system is very unstable. We all sort of have an agreement to abide by it, and we use it, and it is intelligible to us, but it changes, right? It rapidly changes. And again, a lot of the differences in interpretation that the reader response critics pointed out could potentially be attributable to different ways of reading, different ways of understanding language, or at least sort of picking up on different connotations of words, if not totally different meanings. But post-structuralists were interested in how language is very hard to control, but they said that's what these language systems are trying to do, right? We're trying to limit language. We're trying to control language. We're trying to, keep it in this very tight framework so everybody understands it. But they were interested in the times when language kind of broke away from those restrictions. And again, post-structuralism, like we mentioned last week, was rising in the 60s, 70s, kind of a product of that time and other things that were going on throughout the U.S. and really the whole Western world, arguably with protests and a lot of, some social revolution and a lot of change. So post-structuralists still very interested in language, but they're interested in ways that sometimes language can't really be contained within these sort of structuralist systems. And they thought that literature was a prime example of a place where where language can kind of run free, where language can do different things, maybe new things, where language can sort of upset our expectations or create new meaning, or revise older meanings. So that stuff is still interesting to a lot of people, but it's important to remember you don't necessarily have to identify as a structuralist or a formalist. Like if you're doing a close reading, you don't have to say, well, I'm a practitioner of formalism. I mean, we all sort of use that. It's the same with structuralism or post-structuralism. Some of these ideas or some of these approaches or methods are pretty common, and they're used by a lot of literature students. And you can sort of dabble in a lot of different critical schools. You don't have to commit to one, and that's going to be important to remember today as we move through context-based approaches. So I mentioned them last week, but we did not get into them because I said this is really the category, context-based. This is the category that we should probably spend the most time on. Or at the very least, we should just sort of talk about this stuff in relation to our own research, because a lot of the stuff you guys find when you start looking for articles, when you start conducting research for your papers, a lot of the stuff you're going to find will probably qualify as context-based in some way or another. Now, I'm not going to cover all the possible contexts that you might be looking at or reading about, but I'm going to cover some of the big ones. And again, it's okay if you're not necessarily using scholarship like this stuff, but this stuff is common, so you're going to often read it as a student, and perhaps even more importantly, you can start using it. So some of you might have already adopted some critical approaches in previous classes. I think I might have my 203 class do it a little bit, or 205, whatever the intro to lit study is. But I feel like at this level, it's important that we start getting pretty comfortable with it. At the 200 level, we're just sort of experimenting. We're sort of discovering a lot of these critical schools for the first time, because typically we don't do anything with them prior to that. But now at the 300 level, I want you guys to at least be able, if you're reading an article, to just sort of have a general idea of sort of what the article is doing, maybe sort of what critical school does it belong to, what are some of its commitments, maybe political commitments, what are some of the methods or strategies that it's using, to analyze the text in question. And then you can start making some decisions when it comes time to write your papers. You can start thinking about what critical approaches you're interested in. And again, it might be partly based on your research and what you found and what you've been reading, but it can also just be based on how you're reading the literary text, right? You might discover that you fall into kind of one of these categories, or you share some of those commitments or some of the interests that might align you with some of these different critical schools, and then you can start using some of those methods or approaches. And again, you can use a little bit of one and a little bit of another, and then maybe a little bit of a third one. You certainly don't have to stick to one all the time, but some students do kind of identify with a particular approach or a particular sort of orientation. So that's fine too. It's really up to you. You can be as committed as you want to be, or you can just sort of use stuff in a more practical, sort of pragmatic way. Either approach, I think, is effective. So when we're talking about context-based approaches, a couple of things to keep in mind. So we're not forgetting about the text, okay? Let's remember that we still need to anchor our analysis to things that we are finding, identifying in the text. That doesn't change regardless, of the critical approach that we might be using. But what does distinguish the context-based approaches from the ones that we were talking about last week is they are interested in stuff outside the text and also outside the author and outside the reader, right? So just like the formalists, like we said, they rejected those outside contexts. They said, you don't need to know a lot about historical context. You don't need to know about the author's life. You don't need to know about, all these other things that the text might touch on. You just need to study the language of the text. So now we're really kind of on the opposite side of the coin. Context-based approaches are very much about exploring some of the many potential contexts, social contexts, historical contexts, culture, gender-based, race-based, other identity type-based, different, contexts that could have an impact on how we read the text. Things that are going on. Remember what context really means, right? Context just refers to the surroundings of something. So if we think of the literary text as our sort of, our centerpiece, the context is all the stuff around it. All the stuff that surrounds it, all the stuff that influences it, all the stuff that sort of might have had at least some effect on it in some way or another. Maybe those contexts are being reflected within the text, or maybe they drove the production and reception of the text. It kind of depends how you read it and what you're looking at. But we generally acknowledge nowadays, again, we sort of reject the formalist view that you don't need to look at context. That seems a little extreme. We acknowledge that contexts are good. We like contexts. Sometimes we want to focus only on the text. That's when we do a close reading. But we spend a lot of our other analysis time looking at outside context, often historical context. And we're going to talk about that today. The historical approach is really a traditional critical approach. I mentioned that last week. It's been around just like the sort of philosophical or biographical approaches that people were doing centuries ago. But we sort of have a new way of doing historical context analysis. So we'll talk about that. That's certainly a school that a lot of students want to use and sort of identify with because it's relevant, it's popular, and it makes sense for kind of the ways that a lot of us think. So we'll talk about the new historicism today. That's one example of a context-based approach. But like that one, we're going to notice that a lot of these context-based approaches do come from other disciplines. They come from other areas of study. So a little bit like structuralism. Structuralism comes from, like I said, social science largely, and lit scholars adopted it around the middle of the 20th century. So something similar happened with a lot of these context-based approaches. And there's really not a limit. I mean, you could almost list any academic subject or field, and you can probably assume that some lit critic or scholar has used that particular field to approach a text. So you'll find a fair amount of examples of economics, or certain strands of economic theory or economic scholarship can be applied to literature. Also, we're going to talk today about feminism, gender studies. You could extend it to almost any sort of movement, or social movement or political commitment. There's a Marxist school of criticism that's still out there. I mean, it might not mean a whole lot to a lot of us today, but it's out there. You can apply a Marxist reading, to a literary text, or certainly a feminist reading or a queer reading. Post-colonialism is another important context-based approach that we'll mention today, and it can really be filed under the larger category of cultural studies. And cultural studies, like feminism, like post-colonialism, does not exist solely in the realm of literature. This stuff, can be applied to almost any field, but we can use it in literary analysis. So there's going to be a lot of examples of that stuff that's not unique to English and really not necessarily native to English class or literature classes, but we have adopted some of these disciplines, some of these other subjects, or just some of their ideas, right? I mean, we don't have to be economists to use economics to help us read a literary text. We just need to know a little bit. We need to do some research, obviously. We need to be familiar with some scholarly terms and concepts associated with the study of economics, but we don't have to be, we don't have to have advanced degrees in that field, but we need to be able to use it in a sort of interesting, new, different, and productive way to arrive at an original interpretation of a work of literature. So let's just run through some of these. And like I was saying last week, I just want to familiarize you guys with some of these basic critical approaches because they have proliferated, in recent decades. A lot of scholars will point out that, context-based approaches are probably the most popular schools or approaches of literary criticism today. I mean, people still do formalism, people still do structuralism, post-structuralism, sure. But the context-based approaches are often viewed as providing maybe more opportunities for original interpretation. They give you a chance to do different things, bring in different bodies of knowledge. So a lot of people really like them, and they've just been proven to work well when analyzing literature. So let's start with feminism and gender studies. Again, these are not concepts unique to English or literature, but we can use them. And we can define feminism just for our purposes. I know it's a word that people argue about a lot, but it's also a word we can just sort of look up. So we'll just use the standard dictionary definition. So for us, feminism can be defined as a broad set of movements, beliefs, and ideologies designed to advocate or establish equality between the sexes. And there's a lot of different levels of equality, and we don't need to get into all of this today. If you guys are interested, you need to maybe learn more on an individual level, but we can talk about legal equality, we can talk about economic equality, social equality, or even cultural equality in terms of sort of who gets to make the cultural products, the movies, the major works of literature, the TV shows that a lot of us watch or consume, who are the sort of makers of culture, who are the tastemakers, who are the standard setters, who gets to sort of decide what's good or what's not. So you can think about cultural equality as well. But that's just the sort of broad definition that we are working with. Again, we are not typically going to necessarily get overly political, although we can. But I like to just keep the definition broad. But we can use this in a lot of different ways. So again, feminism is a much larger cultural movement. It's not strictly a literary analysis method, right? And people point out that it differs from stuff like formalism or structuralism, which really do sort of kind of work on the level of just sort of analyzing a text. And people say, really, some people would argue that feminism is more of like a political commitment. This sort of movement that can be expressed through the analysis of literature. So certain feminist goals or certain feminist readings of texts can be generated, by using some of these ideas or some of this history. But again, feminism isn't really the exclusive domain of literary analysis. And in some ways, when we use it in literary analysis, we might only be using it in kind of a limited way. And that's true really of any of these context-based approaches. We often just use them to kind of make the points that we want to make or to help us arrive at our original reading. So again, we're not necessarily experts. We don't know everything there is to know about these larger social movements or these other academic fields, but we're going to use what we do know about them and what we find through research to help us with our analysis. So if you're thinking about ways that you might encounter feminist criticism or some ways that you could generate it yourself, there's actually a lot of ways you can go. There's a lot of different possibilities, and you might encounter some of this stuff depending on your topic and what you're researching later in the semester. So I've kind of come up with maybe like 4 different applications of certain feminist theory or just basic feminist thought that we could use in literary analysis. So on one hand, to start, we could sort of focus on studying, re-examining, or rediscovering women authors and characters. So we can go back to older texts. They don't necessarily have to be really old, but often we can really get interested in certain women authors who might have been doing important work, or they might have been providing some kind of important commentary on political or social issues that we're interested in. Or we could really narrow our focus to individual characters within novels or short stories, or potentially other types of literature as well. And just sort of explore like what those characters are doing, what do they express. Maybe they are explicitly feminist characters, or maybe they are identified as feminist authors, but they don't necessarily have to be. Right? A lot of this work can really be centered on rediscovering texts that have fallen a bit by the wayside. We talked about this, I think, weeks ago when I was discussing canon formation in American literary study. And as we sort of developed American literature as a sort of unique academic discipline, we had a group of largely male white scholars that created a pretty exclusive literary canon. At least in its initial form, the canon largely consisted of works written by men, mostly white men, and there weren't a lot of other perspectives from other communities, other kinds of people. Now, we've been trying to rectify that for a long time, so we talk about sort of broadening the canon, diversifying it, bringing different kinds of authors, different kinds of perspectives in there, and that's an ongoing project, certainly. But one thing that we know, that history shows us, literary scholars have pointed this out, historians have pointed this out, a lot of books or works of poetry that were written by women were very popular during their time, but they might have been excluded from a national literary canon, largely because of sexism, because it maybe happened, a while back, or whatever we think the reasons are. And now scholars can revisit some of those texts or even rediscover them and sort of demonstrate what they did in their time period. Maybe we can focus on the injustice of them not being studied or read today in the way that maybe Melville or Hawthorne would be. And there's a lot of work to be done with stuff that was popular, but then it fell out of favor, and now we can sort of rediscover it or reposition it as important as part of our national literary canon. So you can do that with authors, certainly, but then you could do a lot of good character analysis, right? Popular works, lesser known works. You can explore women characters, whether they're explicitly feminist or not, and you can just explore sort of how they function in the world. And again, a lot of feminist analysis will sometimes focus maybe on the oppression or the sort of marginalization of women, or maybe examples of women triumphing over certain social barriers or obstacles, or just blatant examples of sexism and misogyny. But that doesn't have to be necessarily the approach. Sometimes it can just be an examination of how a woman character, or maybe an author, navigates a particular scenario, a particular society, setting, place, time, literary marketplace, if you're thinking about an author. So you can do that. Another approach would be to conduct a sort of feminist reading of a popular text. And a lot of scholars have done this. In some cases, that work is already done in the case of certain texts. But there are other texts that are still out there that could potentially yield some interesting results if you just sort of read them through a feminist lens. And again, this could just mean a commitment to equality. This could mean a focus on the patriarchy and how it's historically marginalized or oppressed women or sort of restricted their options. Or you could explore other things. But when we talk about a feminist reading, that can really be done on any text. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a text written by a woman. Sometimes it can be easier that way, but you could still make the argument that at least there's a character or a scene or an image or a symbol within a text that might express a feminist idea, even if you don't necessarily argue that the text itself is explicitly feminist or the author is explicitly feminist. There might be something within the text, a specific feature, a specific element. Maybe just a line of dialogue, or again, a character, like we were just saying, but some element that you could really grab hold of and analyze more to arrive at, kind of your own original feminist reading. But then there's also what we might consider kind of more like the political side, because this is a political commitment, sort of more so than even a method of literary analysis. And there can also be a sort of push for opening up more opportunities for women artists, women authors. And that could be something you're interested in. Again, that might take you to a little bit more of an author-based approach, or a little bit more of reception theory, where you're thinking about how texts get received, how texts get read. I was mentioning last week that some literary theorists actually study a lot of literary criticism. Sometimes they're not even necessarily focused on the literary text. They're more interested in how people analyze literary texts and sort of our strategies, our methods, our categories, and how we talk about literature. So you might find some interesting sort of gender dynamics within that, and that could be another branch of feminist analysis that you could, potentially conduct. But a lot of critics or scholars of this kind of stuff, or historians of this kind of stuff, will point out that feminism was one of the first sort of social movements, sort of one of the first big social or cultural sort of context-based approaches that made a big impact in literary study. And it kind of opened the door for a lot of other context-based approaches to be adopted by lit scholars. So one thing that we can sort of link pretty clearly to the rise of feminism would be gender studies, which is around today. Doesn't come directly from feminism, but again, feminism sort of opened the door for a lot of these other social theories or movements or disciplines to kind of move into the realm of literary analysis. So again, gender studies is something that a lot of people are using today to analyze texts. And again, you might be using this to analyze contemporary texts. You might be using gender studies to analyze older texts written from previous historical periods. Both are valid. But, we just think of gender studies sort of generally speaking as a sort of close look at gender as being, at least in part, socially constructed. So a lot of these theorists might, or critics might make a distinction between sex, which is largely biological, versus gender, which they might argue has a lot more to do with like social roles. Gender is often thought to be largely socially constructed. There are certain roles, that a society has for men, and then other roles that are largely defined for women. And again, a lot of people think that's fine, but this is just a way to approach certain texts. And again, to think about more sort of societal-based difference and maybe not always necessarily just biological difference. But other critics of this school kind of reject a lot of traditional binaries that might separate, male and female or gay and straight. And again, they would maybe argue that a lot of that stuff is really created by culture or created by human societies. It's not maybe inherent in nature. So those are just some ideas or some theories that could be applied to certain texts or certain characters, maybe an author, but often characters or more specific elements within a text. And then there's also queer theory, which again, it's kind of a similar school, but it might be thought of as a different branch or even a different category. And again, a lot of this stuff kind of rejects a lot of what we might think of as like traditional Western sort of sexual standards and mores. We might argue that a lot of this stuff is changing and people's ideas are changing a little bit, but this is pretty relevant stuff that's happening right now. And again, in some cases, like feminist critics, these types of critics or scholars, they might be rediscovering old texts written by potentially queer authors or featuring queer or non-binary characters that were previously overlooked or previously misunderstood, misrepresented, or perhaps just completely ignored. So they can do that sort of rediscovery work both on the level of author and character within a text. But then also this sort of political commitment to creating more opportunities for these types of communities to express themselves through literature, or more opportunities for these types of characters to get portrayed in popular literature. So that might also be a big part of it. So again, you're going to maybe come across some of this stuff, and if you're interested or if you think it really works well for the chosen text that you are analyzing, you can use this stuff. And if you're interested, I would just really recommend doing a little bit more independent research online, because I'm giving a very broad overview, not just when it comes to feminism and gender studies, but also all of the context-based approaches. So I'm just giving you a really broad sort of summary today. And if you want to use this stuff, you need to dig a little bit deeper. And again, maybe look for some examples. I can try to post some examples this week and next, just so we can see a little bit, like what some of this stuff looks like and reads like. But do some Google searches. Most of these critical schools have a Wikipedia page, or they have some kind of online encyclopedia that talks about them. You can find this information. You can find examples of these schools, and that might be how you find your own calling or find your own sort of context-based commitment. So feminism and gender studies, again, are good examples of how we can adopt, ideas or just basic sort of developments from a larger cultural movement, a social movement that's much bigger than literature, but we can apply it to specific literary text. We do the same thing with cultural studies and post-colonialism, other really prime examples of context-based approaches. So cultural studies is kind of notoriously difficult to define, but again, it's not something that exclusively gets practiced in literature. A lot of other people do it. It can even be sort of thought of as a separate academic discipline. I don't think it would have been thought of that way maybe 25 or 50 years ago, not by everyone at least. But now you actually do have separate departments. Cultural studies in some cases could be a separate degree, and it is kind of a separate discipline because it incorporates a lot of what we might think of as like popular art. Literature being one aspect of a much larger sort of tapestry. So if we're trying to define cultural studies, we might just call it sort of a broad set of practices, kind of like feminism, right? A broad set of practices, political commitments, ideologies, and ideas that's not really quite a unified literary criticism approach. It's really just being sort of adopted by us. Again, it kind of grew out of the cultural turmoil of the 60s and 70s. It does borrow some elements from Marxism, but also from structuralism and post-structuralism and feminism and gender studies, but also a lot of the social sciences like anthropology, sociology. Many would argue that social scientists were doing sort of cultural analysis probably before we were, before lit scholars were. But now it's become sort of more widespread. Historians do it. There are cultural historians who really specialize in, similar work, but also it becomes pretty important for a lot of lit scholars as well. And one final thing we can note just by way of definition, a lot of cultural studies people are interested in how like social and cultural forces can both create communities and promote division. So they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but those are just two things that people are often interested in exploring. And in some cases, they might explore them together, or they might actually sort of explore that apparent paradox. On one hand, a lot of these cultural products that we all know, or just popular culture in general, if we want to think of it that way, it really can be unifying. Right? If we, and we've all seen examples of this, and people talk about it a lot. If a lot of people are watching a TV show, right? If we're all watching the same show and we're at work on a Monday, we're going to talk about that show. We're going to catch up. We're going to share our ideas. We might provide some interpretations. We might have friendly debates with one another. We're going to share our experiences, right? That really does create community. We see how music does this. Sports certainly can do this. So sure, a lot of communities get formed that way, but cultural productions, any kind of art, any kind of pop culture can also promote division. And a lot of people turn to social media in some cases as a good example of how that can happen. So those are just a few possibilities. Again, but a lot of cultural critics or people doing cultural studies, again, they lean a little bit towards I would argue the sort of reader-based approaches, because they're very interested in reception. They're interested in which texts kind of get privileged by the culture, right? Which texts are considered important. And which texts do have the opportunity to create community because they're so widely accessible and they're reaching so many different people, right? So you can think about that a little bit. Why are some texts given that treatment and others aren't? Some would say, well, the best ones are, rise to the top, but who decides that, right? Who gets to decide on those value judgments? And are we influenced as viewers, as readers? Are we sort of told or pushed by anyone as far as what we should like or what we should prioritize or privilege? So we can think about that. But also just sort of stuff that we've already talked about when it comes to these sort of older but still not totally gone distinctions between like literary fiction or like high literature with a capital L versus genre fiction. Because like we talked about weeks ago, a lot of this stuff was loaded with certain like class-based or like other sort of social sort of meaning and ramifications. The way this stuff got talked about, right? Literary fiction was really supposed to be read by college-educated, pretty affluent people, whereas genre fiction or other aspects of what might have been considered sort of earlier examples of pop culture were, thought of as more kind of belonging to middle class, working class people who may have had less education, less sort of cultural refinement, but they wanted to be entertained and they liked good stories and they might have been more inclined to read fantasy or sci-fi or detective stories, right? But there were all these sort of social and class-based assumptions that surrounded all of that, right? Certain kinds of people read high literature and different kinds of people read genre fiction. And again, we don't necessarily put as much stock in that stuff anymore, but there's still analysis to be done because those assumptions or those stereotypes or sort of prejudices, they're not gone, right? If you've ever heard the expression prestige television, I bet you guys have heard that. That gets talked about a lot nowadays because we have so much streaming, we have so many TV shows, but there's kind of been thought of as like a golden age of television that's really extended through a good chunk of this century. Sort of going back to, shows from the earlier 2000s like The Sopranos or The Wire or, Mad Men, and there's others that have come along since then. But there's this sense that there are certain TV shows that are prestigious, right? And it doesn't necessarily, it's not as exclusive as it used to be, but just think about what that means, right? Prestige television. Some shows are really, really good. But what about the shows that aren't considered prestige? What are they? Right? And what do those value judgments mean? What do they mean for audiences? And what do they mean for the ways that we analyze these particular texts, right? Because we can analyze TV shows or movies just like we do literature. They're all texts. So a lot of cultural critics are interested in stuff like that. And again, they're interested in really sort of reclaiming or privileging pop culture in some cases and saying, hey, a lot of this stuff that's been kind of slammed and dismissed and thought of as lesser than for a long time, it's really doing more cultural work. It's more important. It reaches a larger audience. It does more. It does more in the world. And that's a pretty compelling argument, and you can find a lot of evidence for it. I was actually mentioning this weeks ago when we were talking about sci-fi and the rise of other types of genre fiction. And I was saying, a lot of scholars, and again, many of them might be considered scholars of cultural studies, they've kind of done the work and they've shown that like a lot of high literature, a lot of these really important, prestigious cultural productions, they often don't reach a huge audience because they're kind of exclusive, because that target audience for them might be smaller than certain pop culture productions that are meant for the people. They might be more democratic or they're just more inclusive. They're just, maybe easier to access, easier to relate to, maybe even easier to understand in some cases. So again, looking at stuff like romance novels, advertisements, more contemporary musical forms like country or hip hop, and maybe putting some of that stuff alongside Victorian literature or, Shakespeare and making the argument that it's all pop culture, right? A lot of what we think of today as high literature might have started its life as pop culture if it was sort of more successful and popular in its time. So kind of breaking down some of those barriers, rethinking some of these classifications and divisions, but in some cases just pointing out that stuff that might kind of get viewed as trashy or just sort of cheap entertainment, not as intellectually stimulating, not as important in some kind of larger social way, is actually more important and maybe more stimulating than a lot of these other sort of more traditional types of literature. So again, more inclusive syllabi, more inclusive canons, more inclusive ideas of what constitutes really successful art, really good literature, whatever it is that we're looking at. But of course, for us, we're looking primarily at literature. But again, cultural studies people can also engage in some of the same type of work that we've been talking about with feminism and gender studies. They can rediscover texts that were maybe written by, marginalized communities, certain kinds of authors or characters who might have been ignored before. Again, some of this might be genre-based because of the type of cultural production that it was, or who the intended audience was thought to be, might have been racialized or gendered in some way that affected reception and affected how people read it and affected how people talked about it and understood it. So those are all possibilities kind of under that broad heading of cultural studies. And then again, within that broad category, there's post-colonialism, which is kind of a very prominent, specific type of cultural studies that a lot of people are practicing today. And like a lot of these other schools, of course, post-colonialism is not unique to literary study. In fact, we're rarely experts. We're just sort of using it the way we use some of these other academic ideas So we can think of post-colonial criticism as really being focused on former European colonies. And of course, we are an example. And there are many other examples throughout the Western world, throughout the Caribbean, throughout all of the Americas. Obviously, not just North America, but Central and South. You could also look at Africa. You could also look at Southeast Asia. You could look at the South Pacific. Really, European colonialism sort of penetrated almost all the corners of the globe. So there are a lot of possibilities. But typically, if we're looking at these types of spaces, we're interested in a couple of different branches. Again, we might be recovering literature written by indigenous authors. And again, this stuff might have been overlooked or purposefully ignored or neglected when the sort of cultures or societies of those former colonies were getting established, largely by the European colonizers. So we can rediscover indigenous texts. But we can also work to sort of understand how colonialism maybe helped to shape these places. And in some cases, we're looking to maybe just discover authors from these places, maybe, African authors or Black authors in the Caribbean or Latino authors in Latin America who are just sort of commenting or demonstrating some of the legacies of colonialism or just sort of giving us a broader picture of what colonialism was or what it did or how it maybe created these histories of oppression, but also what we might consider to be sort of hybrid cultures, these mixtures of a lot of different people. So again, like feminism, a lot of post-colonial criticism might be focused on the evils and the injustices, foisted upon indigenous people or African people and or people in India or the South Pacific and how their cultures were suppressed, how they were forced to assimilate or sort of adopt the culture or standards of the colonizer. But that's not the only way to apply a post-colonial lens. Again, you can sort of look at after effects, you can look at histories, and you can also try to rediscover indigenous or native authors in those places. So this stuff is all going on. Now I know in this class we're only reading US literature, so we might not have a ton of opportunities to look at, Africa, the Caribbean, or other parts of the world, but a lot of scholars, a lot of lit scholars and historians will make the case that we have a post-colonial legacy of our own in the US. We are an example of a former colonial space, so maybe that matters. Maybe that shows up in a particular text. Maybe it matters for a particular group of people. Maybe it matters for an author. Maybe it matters for characters. Maybe it matters on the level of thematic material in certain texts. Those are determinations that you can make. And then finally, I got two more I want to cover briefly. Let's talk about new historicism, because a lot of us are going to use this and certainly will see it, even if we're not always using the name. So we need to get familiar with it. And like I said, the historical approach to literary criticism is very old. It's one of the original ways that we read and understood literature. But the formalists rejected it, and for a while it maybe kind of fell out of favor. It was kind of viewed as another example of, maybe taking something from outside of literature and using it to study literature. Not everybody loves that, right? I do just want to point that out. The context-based approaches are very popular today, and I would argue that a lot of scholars, a lot of rising scholars, a lot of grad students, a lot of people who want to teach English and literature and publish scholarship, they're doing this kind of work. A lot of them are working within context-based approaches, but not everybody. And there are some traditionalists, formalists, or others who might subscribe to older or just different approaches who say, yeah, we don't love bringing all this other stuff from other disciplines into the study of literature. But we do it with history all the time. Even people who might be a little bit skeptical of using all this social science or using some of these other social movements or ideologies, even the most traditional literary scholar is usually pretty okay with using history. History and lit have often been very friendly. A lot of lit scholars kind of consider themselves to be literary historians. That's kind of what they do in certain cases. So there's a lot of overlap between the disciplines. But when we talk about new historicism, it is a little bit different than the old historical approach to literature or criticism as it would have been practiced, hundreds of years ago. Nowadays, when we think about using history to analyze literature, we kind of moved away from the old model, which was, okay, history's real, right? History is true and fact-based, and literature is largely, imaginative and made up. It might be based on real stuff, but it's largely made up, and that was sort of the key distinction. So we often looked at literature to see how it reflected history, how it taught us something about history. And it's long been regarded that it's often more effective to teach history through literature because oftentimes, is more fun to read than a big history book, like a history textbook. So we've always kind of worked, or for a long time, we've worked with that basic understanding. Like, yeah, history is real, it's true, it's important to know, but it's kind of like medicine. It's not super pleasant, it might not be great going down. So a great way to package it or make it more palatable is to put it in literature or to have literature sort of perform this teaching function. And for a long time, people sort of thought that way. Some still do. But more contemporary criticism and theory points out that history isn't quite as rock solid and always true and never changing as we maybe thought it was 50, 100, 200 years ago. And what we're starting to notice more and more is that a lot of history might actually read a little bit like literature. And then a lot of literature might read like history. So we're largely kind of doing away with some of these really, firm boundaries between the disciplines. And we're looking at how a work of literature can sort of serve a historical function. It can teach about history. It can comment upon history. It might revise certain assumptions that we have about history. It might introduce a new history, a hidden history that we haven't previously learned, or it might give us a new perspective on a history that we have learned, or it might just teach us, something brand new altogether. So literature can work like that. And then we can also see how history borrows a lot of techniques and elements from literature. And if you guys have ever read a history book or watched the History Channel, you know this, right? The way history often gets packaged and delivered to an audience is in the form of narrative, right? We have characters, we have a plot, there's usually some kind of a theme, there's some kind of a larger meaning or takeaway that we're supposed to understand by the end of it, right? There's sort of a plot triangle, right? We have rising action, we have a climax, because it's long been understood that that's the best way to get people to remember something is to make it a story. That's the best way to get them interested, to get them engaged, and to make them remember. So if we know that, and we know that history is often kind of written that way, and certainly a lot more contemporary history, right? There's a lot of pop history now, best-selling books that are written to appeal to a wide audience. Not an old-timey history textbook from a class, but stuff that's really, fun and interesting and vibrant. So if we kind of can observe some of these trends, we'll notice that history has a big influence on literature, but literature has a big influence, an equally big influence on history. So there's a famous quote from this scholar named Michael Warner who says, "The text is always historical." Right? So he's saying every text has a history, even if it's not historical fiction, even if it's not specifically sort of interested in the teaching of history. Every text is at least a sort of artifact of a time and place, or it's a product of a particular time and place. So every text has a history. It is historical always. And then he says history is always textual, which means that history always kind of feels or reads like a narrative. The way we understand history And again, we can get into a lot of social and cultural concerns here because we can talk about the way history gets taught, the way historical figures get remembered, the way we kind of remember the winners versus the losers of various conflicts or historical developments. There's a lot there, and again, a lot of what we know or understand about our own history, the history of the world, it's stories, right? It's characters, it's scenes, it's plot lines, it's thematic material, right? We use the basic ingredients of literature. We use the basic literary elements that we all know in order to tell and understand history. So, again, that's kind of true, and if it's true, that opens up a lot of things that we can do with historical scholarship. But again, the new historicists would kind of reject the old historical approach to literary criticism because they would say what those old guys were doing was they were just showing how literature could reflect history. We might do that, sure, like that's one of the things that we're going to do, but we want to do other things. We also want to show how history can reflect literature. And how there can be this really interesting interplay or dynamic between the two. And again, they're arguing that history can really be just as nuanced, just as complex, and just as unstable, really, as literature or literary language, especially if we're noticing that a lot of literary language and techniques are also showing up in history. But again, there's a certain ambiguity with a lot of historical narratives that we would often also, expect to find in literature. In fiction, certainly. Multiple possible meanings, different ways to interpret it. Not everybody interprets historical events the same way. And there's plenty of examples in the U.S. alone that you could look at. Different communities, people from different backgrounds, understanding the same events in profoundly different ways. Just like if you and I read the same novel, we might have two very different understandings of that novel. So again, isn't that very similar with literature and history? So history can have contradictions, multiple meanings, ambiguity, omissions. Sometimes narrators are not reliable. There can be surprises, twist endings, whatever. So just kind of an interesting wheelhouse that you can get into. And even if you're kind of thinking of yourself as more of a traditional practitioner of the historical approach and you're just really interested in the history that is getting reflected by the literary text, that's fine as a starting place. But at some point, you need to analyze some of the historical documents that you're finding through research. And some of the history, whether it's getting delivered in the form of articles or books, stuff from a textbook, stuff that's more contemporary and poppy, whatever it is, you need to read that history a little bit like literature, just like you're reading the literature a little bit like history. If you can just make that move, that sort of double move, where you're joining the two and finding overlap and finding interesting connections, then you're engaged in new historicism. Even if you don't necessarily call yourself a new historicist, that is kind of what you're doing. And a lot of critics, a lot of scholars do this. So finally, I wanted to wrap up with the psychological approach. I kind of wanted to mention this last week, but I just forgot, ran out of time, whatever you want to say, ran out of space and sort of bandwidth. So we could really file this one under the author-based approaches, maybe. That's the way it was traditionally done. I would argue we don't really have to think of it as an author-based approach. But just using psychology, or to be a little bit more precise, using psychoanalysis as it has been kind of passed down from Freud and Lacan. I'm not going to give you guys a gloss on psychology. I know a lot of you have taken a psychology class before, and if you haven't, you can access a lot of this information online. We all know who Freud is, probably. And some of his stuff has been discredited, but we still use some basic concepts from psychoanalysis to help us analyze lit. So traditionally, this was considered an author-based approach because a lot of critics would say, oh, well, if we can find some kind of psychological motivation or some kind of, subconscious desire being expressed in the text, then we can attribute that to the author. Right? We can attribute something about the id or the ego or the superego or like an Oedipal complex or whatever. We can attribute that to the author. But a lot of critics now would say, well, we can, but we don't necessarily have to, right? Like if there's a character in a text who seems to be, again, sort of acting out a particular psychological concept or is exhibiting signs of psychological distress, we can analyze that character through that prism of psychology. Again, we're adopting this other discipline. We're adopting some key ideas and terminology from this other discipline to help us analyze a literary text. I mean, Hamlet is often a famous example of this, right? A lot of readings of Hamlet, a lot of interpretations of that famous play are really centered around the psychology of the character. Why is he acting this way? Like, what's going on with his relationship, with his parents? What's going on with his relationship with his girlfriend? Like, he's acting in a very strange manner. So there's been all kinds of interpretations over the years that argue that he's suffering from depression. We can diagnose him. We can talk about psychological motivations. A lot of people use him as kind of an example of the Oedipal complex. Again, borrowing terms and concepts from psychology to understand this character. We don't have to attribute all the stuff going on with the character to the author. We don't have to say that's really how the author feels, but maybe we think so. If we can find evidence, if we can find support, we could maybe make a psychological case about the author and sort of what the author is trying to communicate or express, but that's not the only way to use the psychological approach. You can also focus on a character, on a symbol, any element, any feature, if you think it sort of is utilizing a psychological concept, or if we can use psychology to help explain it and understand it. So those are the main approaches that I wanted you guys just to be familiar with. I'll post a sort of updated list like I did last week, but it will have more schools, more approaches of criticism. So you guys just have written notes on this stuff, and I can offer a little bit more detail in those written notes than I want to necessarily get into here out loud. So you have those resources. If you have questions about any of this stuff, let me know. I'm a little pressed for time right now, but later in the week, I'll try to post a few example articles, some sample, it's just examples of literary criticism from some of these different schools or approaches, so you guys can get a little bit more comfortable. And pretty soon, we'll start researching for ourselves. So next week, we're going to broaden the conversation a little bit. We're not going to talk about specific critical schools. We're going to talk about entering a larger critical conversation, which is what you guys have to do at the end of the semester in our big literary research paper. So we'll start talking a little bit more about that assignment and entering the larger critical conversation next week. So if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next week.